Thanks very much for coming along tonight for the second attempt at getting over the gremlins or the brownies, as our friend Robert Louis Stevenson might have called them. Um, so far, we seem to be winning. So let's carry on before the brownies come back. Um, this is called Robert Louis Stevenson, Traveling for Traveling's Sake: A Life in 8 Books. So welcome to this talk. Uh, it's on the 19th century's most popular writers, one of the most popular writers, subtitled Travelling for Travelling's Sake. Stevenson was an inveterate traveller, ostensibly in search for a cure for his poor health, but most obviously because he loved a life of adventure and personal challenge, something which is reflected in everything he wrote. This talk's structured around 8 books, and it's divided into 9 sections. Oh, and that did work. Okay. And this is the man we're talking about. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in 1850 and died in 1894. And I did say that I was going to structure it around 8 books, many of which you'll recognise. The first of these is A Child's Garden of Verses. It's a poetry book and published in 1885, and it's the place where, for generations of people, Stevenson is first encountered. He was always known to his family and friends as Louis, at least as an adult. He was born at 8 Howard Street in Edinburgh on the 13th of November 1850 and christened Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson. He changed the Louis to Louis when he was 18 and dropped the Balfour completely, hence his RLS initials that you can just see on the gate of his birthplace, I think. Stevenson was the son of a famous father who had made his name and his fortune by designing more than 40 lighthouses around the coast of Scotland. He invented the revolving light that we see in lighthouses to this day. Thomas Senior had also come from a family of engineers. Here is one of his lighthouses in the Shetland Islands. And there is the family. This is Stevenson's father, Thomas, and his mother, Margaret Balfour, a Church of Scotland minister's daughter. Louis was their only child. The girl in the second picture is a cousin. Even more influential in his early life, though, was his nursemaid, Alison Cunningham, always known as Cummy. She was 35 when she first joined the family. She was a great storyteller, but also a strict Calvinist, who introduced him to the perils of sin, hellfire, and damnation. She would remain with the family until his 22nd birthday. It was significant then that when in 1885 the 35-year-old author published A Child's Garden of Voices, it was Garden of Verses, isn't it? It was dedicated to Alison Cunningham rather than to his parents, and included the lines, "My second mother, my first wife, the angel of my infant life, from the sick child now well and old, take nurse the little book you hold." It's a reminder also that Louis was a sickly child, and for most of his adult life, a sickly adult as well, with a lung condition for which he was always trying to find a cure. Here he is as a 7-year-old, as yet unbreached. I think it's fair to say that, taken as a whole, Robert Louis Stevenson was not a great poet, though his Child's Garden of Verses is probably his most successful. Here, read for yourself Where Go the Boats, where he captures the child's perspective and a sense of childhood adventure, longing and restlessness that characterises his own personality. A substantially respectable middle-class family then, with a solid religious background, wealth and influence. Just before he turned 7, Stevenson began his formal schooling at Mr. Henderson's school in Edinburgh. But throughout his childhood, his poor health meant that he will often only last a few weeks at a time before being educated at home by private tutors. He did, though, spend a term in a boarding school in Middlesex, England, before completing his education at the Edinburgh Academy. Following in the footsteps of his paternal grandfather, father, and uncles, he did at first enroll on an engineering degree at Edinburgh University. But a mixture of disinterest, he could never master the mathematics, and indolence. He often missed lectures and enjoying the local bordellos and drinking houses instead, meant that his father eventually permitted him to change his degree to law. He did eventually qualify for the Scottish Bar. That's the legal one, and not the one where you buy drinks, in July 1875. But by then, he'd set his heart on becoming a writer. Throughout his teenage and student years, Louis was also travelling, first with his father to Germany and the continent, and then to Menton on the French Riviera for the sake of his health. And then during his university holidays with his father again to inspect the family's engineering works. In 1868, 1869 and 1870, for example, they travelled to the north of Scotland, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and shown here the island of Ereid, sometimes pronounced Erit, and shown on the Isle of Mull, where Stevenson stayed for 3 weeks. He enjoyed the travel much more than the engineering, and these places would later greatly influence his writing. And that's one book out the way already. Well, we're now on the second book, Travels with a Donkey, the second of the 8 books, a travel log, which was published in 1879. But first I need to put it into context. At the beginning of 1873, the year before his qualification as a lawyer, Louis had announced to his father that he no longer believed in the Christian religion. It was deeply shocking to his parents, and for a year he and his father were at loggerheads over his agnosticism. He had adopted bohemian dress, and along with his cousin Bob Stevenson, joined the Liberty, Justice and Reverence Club, whose first tenet was, disregard everything our parents have taught us. During that summer, he spent 5 weeks in July and August with a married cousin, Maud Balfour, at the Cockfield Rectory near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk. It was here that he first met Fanny Sitwell, 11 years his senior, and fell in love for the first time. She was the estranged wife of a clergyman with 1 child. She had modelled for Edward Burne-Jones, a portrait used for the head of the Virgin in his final version of the Annunciation. Julia Jackson, Virginia Woolf's mother, played the same role earlier in an earlier version of the Annunciation. Accompanying her to Suffolk was Sidney Colvin, newly appointed Slade Professor of Fine Art at Cambridge, who would become Stevenson's lifelong friend and his literary agent, and who would much later marry Fanny Sitwell for himself when her first husband died in 1903. The three would remain firm friends for life. 2 years later, he would also meet another close friend, at least until 1888, the poet William Ernest Henley. He'd been introduced to him by Leslie Stephen, the editor of the Cornhill magazine, for which he had contributed an essay on Victor Hugo the previous year. Henley had lost his left leg as a boy as a result of tuberculosis of the bone, and was in the Edinburgh Infirmary under the care of the famous surgeon Joseph Lister, who had managed to save his second leg from amputation. It was about this time that he wrote his most famous poem, Invictus, with its stoical lines of the Victorian stiff upper lip, the title which today gives us Harry Winter's Invictus Games. Stevenson would later go on to collaborate with Henley in writing plays, most notably Deacon Brodie, first performed in 1882, about the double life of a respectable Edinburgh cabinet maker who was also a criminal, a theme that Stevenson would later develop in his most famous novel of Dual Identity. It's often also said that Stevenson's most famous pirate, Long John Silver, was inspired by his friend, with one leg as described here. Which I'll let you read, will I? Despite his own ill health, parodying Hamlet, Stevenson once declared, I carry the art of spitting blood to a pitch not previously dreamed of in my philosophy. He was nevertheless driven by the challenge of the active life. He once wrote that for him, life offered three things. He particularly valued women, wine, and adventure, but of these he valued adventure most of all. He was a frequent visitor to France and Belgium, and in 1876, inspired by the exploits of the canoeist John Rob Roy MacGregor in the 1860s, undertook a 200-mile canoeing trip across France and Belgium with Walter Simpson, who'd been a fellow member of the prestigious debating club at Edinburgh University, of which he too had been a member. His account of this journey, which was not without incident, is recounted in his book An Inland Voyage, published in 1878. 1876, though, was also the year of his first meeting with Fanny van der Grift Osborne, the woman who would be his inspiration and mentor for the rest of his life. Once again in the south of France for the sake of his health and his cultural education, Stevenson met Fanny at an art colony in Grèze-sur-Loire, not far from Barbizon, made famous by an impressionist school of artists. At Grèze, his favourite cousin Bob had also set up residence. Fanny was an American who separated from her philandering husband, but who had come to France to study and practice art with her daughter Isabel and son Lloyd. They became lovers, and Stevenson spent part of the next year with her and her two children in Paris and Fontainebleau, near Grèze-sur-Loire, before she returned to San Francisco to seek a divorce. Meanwhile, Stevenson's parents, on whom he was still financially dependent, were distraught and horrified at this developing relationship with a married woman, and with an American at that, which kept on drawing their son back from London and Edinburgh. Stevenson's recently published article in the Cornell magazine on falling in love can have done little to reassure them. It was in August 1878 that Fanny returned to America, and perhaps to distract himself, as well as to gather material for a book, Stevenson had set off in September on a 12-day hike through the Cevennes district of south-central France, accompanied by a donkey called Modestine. It begins with a dedication to Sidney Colvin and ends with a dedication to the donkey, who at least at first was, well, predictably, as stubborn as a donkey. In their 120-mile journey together, he describes the beautiful mountain scenery along the way and the interesting characters they meet. And in extolling the virtues of travel, he gives us the subtitle with which I began. He said, "For my part, I travel not to go anywhere, but to go. I travel for travel's sake. The great affairs is to move, to feel the needs and hitches of our life more nearly, to come down off this feather-bed civilization and find the globe granite underfoot and strewn with cutting flints. For me, this epitomizes his adventurous, restless spirit, which is at the heart of his life and of his writing." And here are more pictures of the Cevennes and a map to show his route from the village of Le Monastier to Saint-Jean-du-Gard, where he sold Modestine with the shedding of many tears. There are moments when it's clear that his mind is on love, but one of the most interesting threads concerns religion. It was obviously something that weighed heavily on him at this time after his year-long quarrel, which had now ended amicably. The Cevennes was the site of a Protestant rebellion in the early years of the 18th century. It was a subject that was close to his heart. His first piece of published writing was on the Pentland Rising of 1666, when the Scottish Covenanters were defeated by the Royalists. The book had been funded by his father, who subsequently bought up every single copy to save embarrassment. On his travels, Stevenson visited a Catholic monastery, Our Lady of the Snows, and the Protestant community of the Cevennes, and came down mostly in favour of the latter. The travelogue was published in 1879. Fanny's reconciliation with her husband was short-lived. After separating from him, she settled in Monterey with her two children, and she sent a telegram to Stevenson to inform him of her imminent divorce and her current illness. Without a word to his parents, he immediately set out for America at the beginning of August 1869, arriving in New York after an arduous journey 2 weeks later. During the voyage, his health had deteriorated, but again, he kept a travel log of the people he met in steerage and the hierarchy on board ship. This account would be published as The Amateur Emigrant in his final year. Having spent the night in New Jersey, he set off again, this time by train, on the 18th of August 1879 across the continent of America, arriving by the 30th on the west coast. The complete account of his journey would not be published until 1892. By the time he arrived in Monterey, he was not only near penniless, but also near death after the exertions of his journey. He was nursed back to health by some local ranchers before moving to San Francisco, where again his health deteriorated, and where he lived in poverty on 45 cents a day. This time, it was the newly divorced Fanny who came to his rescue and nursed him back to health at her San Francisco home. At the beginning of their relationship together, he was very much the invalid, coughing up blood. He had, moreover, very little money. She was later often portrayed as a willful American woman 10 years his senior, who was lucky to marry such a revered expat, but the reverse is more likely to be true. He was the one still dependent on parental handouts, although his father, who had previously cut off his support, now relented and promised him £250 annually that April. But Fanny was the one whose charm would later reconcile him to his parents, whose critical judgment would support his genius, and whose concern for his health would constantly be the motivation for seeking healthier places to live. They married on the 19th of May 1880 and honeymooned in the Napa Valley, 50 miles northeast of San Francisco. The Napa Valley there looks like idyllic, but although they liked Calistoga, they decided to take refuge higher in the mountains for the sake of his health. They found an abandoned silver mine high up on Mount Helena and lived there along with Lloyd and the family dog. After 2 months in Silverado, their possessions stolen by another family while they were away, the Stevensons had finally had enough. And with Stevenson fully recovered, they decided it would be wise now to return to Europe and for father and son to be reconciled. On July the 29th, they left Silverado for New York and sailed from New York to Liverpool, where his family was waiting to welcome them. It would not be long before he would embark on the novel for which he is probably best known, Treasure Island. And that's the third of the 3 novels here, which is there. Treasure Island was published in book form in 1883, but it made its first appearance in a magazine for young people called Young Folks, when it was serialized between October 1881 and January 1882. It was entitled The Sea Cook, and Robert Louis Stevenson's pseudonym was given as the solidly English Captain George North. There had been pirate stories before, but never has there been a better one. Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife had returned to Great Britain, but by October had been advised to go to Davos in Switzerland for their health. His home in Scotland was first in Pitlochry and then in Braemar in August 1881, shown here. And it was here that he began writing Treasure Island, beginning with a treasure map that he had drawn to amuse Lloyd, his stepson, during a period of not unusual heavy Scottish rain, complete with a bold red cross where the treasure was hidden. Jim Hawkins, the 13-year-old hero of the novel, was a similar age to Lloyd at that time. At Braemar, he wrote 15 chapters of Treasure Island and completed it in Davos in Switzerland. He was serialised in Young Folks between October 1881 and January 1882. The novel contains one of the great ambiguous characters in English literature, the duplicitous but arguably admirable Long John Silver, inspired perhaps, as I've said, by his friend W.E. Henley. And then there's the map, which Stevenson drew for the 1883 book edition of the novel. Most people now agree that the description of the island does not match that of a Caribbean island, but it's more akin to the peninsula at Monterey, where Stevenson lived in 1879. But I think its shape is better suited to those islands off the Scottish coast, such as Ereid here, that Stevenson had earlier visited with his engineer father. You decide. But who can forget the plot line with its cast of memorable characters such as Billy Bones with his mysterious treasure chest and map, Black Dog with his former shipmate who recognises him, Blind Pew with his black spot, Israel Hands the pirate who with true British pluck young Jim Hawkins kills by throwing him off the yardarm, or Ben Gunn the castaway. There's a clear distinction between the respectable, well-to-do characters like Squire Trelawney and Dr. Livesey, and the low-life sea dogs who mutiny aboard the ship and scheme to steal the treasure. But such distinctions can be taken with a pinch of 19th century salt or perhaps snuff. And we can't leave Treasure Island without asking that very pressing question, at least in the part of the world where I live, as to why all pirates have to speak with a Dorset accent. The actor Robert Newton is perhaps the reason. It was he who played Long John Silver in the 1950 Disney adaptation of Treasure Island and the subsequent Australian television programme, which hit our screens in 1954. Robert Newton from Shaftesbury was a Dorset man born and bred, and so could say "Arr, Jim lad" with the best of them, and convincingly too. By this time in his life, Stevenson was spending his summers in various parts of Scotland and his winters in the south of France, where two of his finest Scottish short stories were written. In 1884, the threat of a cholera epidemic in Hyères drove him back to England, and was there that he began to write Kidnapped, the first of the Scottish novels. Although its sequel, Catriona, wasn't written until much later, the two are best taken together. Kidnapped was written in Bournemouth in 1886, while Catriona was written in Upolu, Samoa in 1893, but more of that later. All his life, Stevenson identified with the romance of the Scottish past and the brutal conflicts that had forged its history. In these four novels, he got his inspiration from that past. Both Kidnapped and Catriona have a common ancestor. In 1881, Stevenson had unsuccessfully applied for the post of Professor of Constitutional Law and History at Edinburgh University. Meanwhile, his father, Thomas, could never resist a bookshop. And when browsing in Inverness one day, he came across the book entitled The Trial of James Stewart. And as the title page states, a trial for the murder of Colin Campbell of Glenure in 1753. Thinking this might be useful for his new post, his father bought the book and sent it to his son. Give me a second. The trial took place 7 years after the defeat of the Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden on the 27th of April, 1746, and at a time when the victorious Hanoverians and their Scottish allies were intent on suppressing any sign of rebellion. Colin Campbell, nicknamed the Red Fox, was the government-appointed factor, tasked with the eviction of the Stuarts of Appin. On the 14th of May 1752, while on the way to another mass eviction, he was shot in the back by a marksman in the woods behind him, not as in the front, as here. As a consequence, James Stuart, chief of the Stuarts of Appin, was arrested, tried and hanged for a murder of which he was innocent. His body was left hanging in chains for 2 years and guarded by soldiers as a warning to others, who might want to raise the Jacobite standard once again. Today there's a monument near the Ballachulish Bridge over Loch Linney, not far from Glencoe, and the name of the real assassin is still a secret, preserved in the memory of the Stuarts of Appin and passed down through the generations. Kidnapped tells the story of David Balfour, a boy from a Covenanting family who inadvertently witnessed the murder, and who meets up with Alan Breck Stewart, a Jacobite suspected of being implicated in it. They meet when the ship on which David has been kidnapped, poignantly called the Covenant, sold into Barbadian slavery by a wicked uncle, collides with the boat in which Alan Breck Stewart is escaping. They share many adventures together as they are chased across Rannoch Moor, until they're ferried across the Firth of Forth and part in Edinburgh. David sets off to his banking to claim his inheritance, and Alan heads off to exile in France. Like Treasure Island and the Black Arrow, Kidnapped was first serialised in the Young Folks paper, before being published in book form the following year. The first novel had ended very suddenly and feels unfinished, due to another bout of illness. Its sequel, Catriona, written 7 years later, completes the story. It mainly focuses on David Balfour's coming of age, inheriting wealth, and falling in love with the daughter of a scurrilous Jacobite. Alan Breck Stewart does make an appearance, but not as much as many readers had hoped for. It's generally regarded as a more complex novel than Kidnapped, with more sophisticated themes of justice, romance, and political intrigue, with the trial and hanging of James Stewart still there in the background. Stevenson writes about locations that he knows, including, as here, the Bass Rock in North Berwick. It's here that David Balfour is for a time imprisoned. It's described by Stevenson in words which don't shy away from his new, more confident use of the Scottish dialect, one of the features that distinguishes Catriona from Kidnapped. Unco here means remarkable, extraordinary, awful, strange, and perhaps a combination of all four. It's a stunning description. It was an unco place by night, unco by day, and there were unco sounds of the calling of the Solons, and the plash of the sea, and the loch echoes that hung continually in our ears. Stevenson's writing was always inspired by the landscapes that he knew, and the Lochaber region of northwest Scotland was no different. Here, from top to bottom, I've circled the bridge over Loch Linney, next to which the body of James of the Glen was hung in chains. Ballachulish had been one of the places that Stevenson had stayed in 1882. I've circled the woods of Lettermore, where Colin Campbell had been murdered, and the island of Ereid, where David Balfour was shipwrecked and kidnapped. It was travelling in this part of the world that first drew me to Stevenson. Out at sea, some distance from Ereid, there are two lighthouses that Stevenson's father was instrumental in building. The southern one, pictured here bottom right, is called Dŵr Atach, while the northern one is called Skerry Vor. The cove on the left was renamed Balfour Cove after Stevenson's hero, who was shipwrecked near the island and washed up on this beach. Skerry Vor was also the name Stevenson gave to the house where he lived in Bournemouth for 3 years between 1885 and 1887. The house was a wedding present from his father to his daughter-in-law, whom the Stevensons now loved as their own. Louis and his wife had moved to Bournemouth the previous July and stayed at various locations before settling in Skerry Vor, now only a footprint following a stray Luftwaffe bomb. His health during the Bournemouth years was not good, so much so that he was frequently unable to leave the house, But the Bournemouth years proved to be some of his most productive, with not only the publication of Kidnapped, but also A Child's Garden of Verses, Prince Otto, a romance novel set in mid-century Europe, one of whose one of whose chapters was rewritten 8 times by Stevenson and once by Fanny. The Gothic short stories of Olala and the Body Snatchers, The Dynamiter, a short story collection in collaboration with Fanny, and a melodramatic farce entitled Macaire in collaboration with W.E. Henley. Most famously of all, however, was the Gothic horror novella that he wrote there even before Kidnapped, that he is best known for today. Which brings us to Book 6. In January 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson sat down to write a first draft of the novel that would explore the duality of human nature and the evil that arguably lurks within us. It would become a classic of the Gothic genre. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Its genesis is an interesting one. His first draft was met with Fanny's critical eye, who criticised it for its lack of allegorical depth, its moral core. Stevenson's reaction was to toss it into the fire there and then and begin again. Within 3 days, he had rewritten it to create the masterpiece we know today. It sold 40,000 copies within the first 6 months. Writing 13 years before Freud's interpretation of dreams, and using the classic Gothic trope of doubling, Stevenson's novel poses many troubling questions about the nature of civilization, the difference between the animal and the human, the possibility of the human race returning to a primitive state, the consequences of sexual perversion, and the nature of evil. Dr. Jekyll is a respected physician and scientist whose experimentation with the drugs for the best motives leads to the creation of an alter ego who is base, violent, and depraved. As in Wuthering Heights, the tale is told first of all through the prism of the respectable outsider, Mr. Utterson, who doesn't comprehend what he is seeing. The revelation that Mr. Hyde is really also Dr. Jekyll comes later in the novella, a real shock to the first readers of this story, and a secret handled with consummate skill. When asked in 1887 by an American journalist about the origin of the story, Stevenson stated, "At night, I dreamt the story, not precisely as it's written, but practically it came to me as a gift. I awoke, and before I again went to sleep, almost every detail of the story as it stands was clear to me." He would later refer to the muses of his creativity as his brownies. The term a Jekyll and Hyde character has now passed into the English language. But for the first readers and for the first theatre goers who saw the dramatic transformation happening before their eyes, it came as a real shock. For the Victorians, the story had a particular resonance because it began to be dramatised very near to the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, which were taking place in nearby Whitechapel. The first British dramatisation began on the 4th of August 1888 at the Lyceum Theatre in London with the actor Richard Mansfield. The stage transformation was so convincing that he was reported to the police as a likely Ripper suspect. The notion that the Ripper murderer might be a member of respectable society with a dual personality took root, and there's no doubt that Stevenson's novella fueled that assumption. Two members of respectable society that Stevenson befriended in Bournemouth and who were not suspected of the Ripper murders were the American author Henry James and Sir Percy Shelley, the only son of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley and his second wife Mary. Henry James had come to Bournemouth to be near his sick sister, and on calling on Stevenson for the first time was dismissed by the servants as a tradesman because of his shoddy dress. He became a close friend and frequent visitor to Stevenson's home. Sir Percy Shelley had come to nearby Boscombe Manor for the sea air and would famously arrange for the removal of his mother's remains, along with those of her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, brought from St Pancras Churchyard in London and interred in St Peter's Churchyard, Bournemouth. For good measure, he also buried Shelley's heart with her, reportedly saved from Shelley's funeral pyre on the beach at Via Reggio. For those Bournemouth years, then, it could be argued that both the authors of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the author of Frankenstein were resting in close proximity to one another. And this is the portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson, which was taken by Percy Shelley. During this time in Bournemouth, Stevenson would visit the author Thomas Hardy in nearby Dorchester, with Fanny famously being very rude about his wife Emma. And Stevenson was frequently visited by the great and the good. One visitor was the painter John Singer Sargent, who created these two images in 1885 and 1887 respectively. The first shows Stevenson in a typically restless pose, with Fanny lying on a chaise longue wrapped in an Indian shawl. Stevenson called this painting "the picture of the caged animal lecturing about the foreign specimen in the corner," while the second shows Stevenson sat in Henry James's chair, characteristically smoking. He once said that the only time he wasn't smoking was when he was coughing or kissing. And that takes us to the seventh book. Stevenson's next Scottish novel was The Master of Ballantrae, A Winter's Tale. It's a novel which certainly begins in Scotland with the doomed rising of 1745. Two brothers, noblemen heirs to the estate of Ballantrae, a region of South Ayrshire, toss a coin to decide who will join the Jacobite cause and who will stay at home to hold the estate for the crown if that side should emerge triumphant. They were obviously hedging their bets. The swashbuckling but malevolent James Dury returns from defeat at Culloden, where it's rumoured he has betrayed his own side, to reclaim the estate and the woman his more honourable brother Henry has married. James disappears when he's bested in a duel by his brother, and supposedly killed only to be spirited away to scheme another day. Thereafter, the action ranges widely from war with the French in India, where James has found an outlet for his swashbuckling derring-do, to New York, where Henry's wife has an estate, and then to the Adirondacks Mountains, where James goes in search of his brother. Along the way, there are pirates who make their victims walk the plank, Native Americans who scalp their enemies, and mountain men searching for buried treasure. There are moments when it feels like Rob Roy has stumbled into the last of the Mohicans. Despite this, and despite a very unsatisfactory ending, it's a novel with some powerful writing and some thought-provoking moral ambiguities. Nor was the landscape that Stevenson described outside his experience. Stevenson's father had died in May 1887, and the following August Stevenson had set out for New York with a view to moving to Colorado. However, on the way, he discovered a mountain retreat for those with chronic pulmonary illness in upstate New York at Saranac Lake, in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains. He would stay here at Baker Cottage from the 3rd of October 1887 to the 13th of April 1888 during a harsh winter. During this time, he managed to fall out seriously with W.E. Henley, something which would later impact on Stevenson's literary reputation. Henley had accused Fanny of plagiarism in her short story, The Nixie, which he believed had a too close resemblance to a similar story by Stevenson's cousin Catherine de Matos, Bob Stevenson's sister. Robert Louis Stevenson stood by his wife. It may have been the harshness of the winters here, Lloyd, Fanny and Stevenson here wrapped in furs, that persuaded the family, Belle and Margaret, his mother, here with Fanny and Stevenson on the chaise longue, to undertake a cruise to a warmer climate, and that was just what they did next. It was a Pacific voyage made possible by a commission to produce a series of travel articles on the South Seas for a newspaper syndication. Abandoning the plan to go to Colorado by the 7th of June 1888, they had reached San Francisco, And by the 26th, Louis, Fanny, his mother Margaret, Belle, and Lloyd had boarded the schooner Casco to begin their ocean adventure. Stevenson once wrote, "I loved a ship as a man loves burgundy or daybreak." And as we know, he was a restless soul who loved to travel and for whom the sea air proved good for his health. Fanny was also a free spirit who revelled in the adventure. Between June 1888 and July 1890, Stevenson and his family sailed on 3 ships with intermittent stops in some of the places they visited. On the Casco, they cruised to the Pacific islands of the Marquesas, the atolls of the Tuamotu archipelago, Tahiti, and Hawaii. In Tahiti, they spent months as guests of Chief Ori, and on Hawaii, they were feted by the ukulele-playing King Kalakaua, pictured here. Stevenson even found time to visit Father Damien's famous leper colony at Molokai. This first cruise ended in Honolulu on the 24th of January 1889. Stevenson and his stepson Lloyd then set off on another cruise, this time on the SS Equator, to the Gilbert Islands and eventually to the place he would call home, Samoa. He wrote to a friend, Lady Taylor, back in Bournemouth about being tossed upon Pacific seas and walking on coral shores before reassuring her of his much improved health. The good fun he refers to them having includes spearing a fish from the deck of the Equator, as shown here. On Apamama, they found themselves guests of the tyrannical King Tembinoka, known as the Napoleon of the Gilbert Islands. They ended their voyage in Apia, on the island of Upolu, Samoa, on December 1889. They were so taken with the place that within weeks they had purchased 314 acres on the side of Mount Vea, overlooking Apia Harbour, and arranged for a house called Velima to be built there while they continued their cruise to Australia, New Zealand, and the other Pacific islands. By September, they had returned to their new home in Samoa. As well as travelling, at this period in Stevenson's life is characterised by a rich vein of creativity. In January 1893, he published his South Sea Tales, of which the best 2 are The Beach of Falesa and The Ebb Tide. Between July and August 1892, The Beach at Falesa was serialised in the Illustrated London News, though it was begun in Sydney 2 years before. John Wiltshire is a copra trader, the dried white fruit of the coconut from which coconut oil is extracted, who arrives at the fictional Pacific island of Falesa and is married to a native girl, Uma, in a faux marriage ceremony organised by a rival trader called Case. He falls in love with Uma, learns that she has a taboo associated with her, the reason why Case had arranged the marriage, and exposes the hold Case has over the islanders by the use of trickery, which suggests he has demonic powers. It's important as it marks a move away from romantic fiction to realism and exposes the hypocrisy of the colonial elites who exploited these islands. His friends back home in Britain were not happy with this change of direction, hence Edmund Goss's cryptic comment quoted above. The Ebb Tide was a collaboration with his stepson Lloyd Osborne. Again, it's a novel noted for its realism and its debunking of the colonial stereotype of the morally superior European. When 3 reprobates are given command of a ship they intend to steal before meeting their match with a ruthlessly violent evangelical aristocrat on his own pearl-rich South Sea atoll. So by the end of 1890, after nearly 3 years of travel, the Stevensons were ready to settle in their final family home on the island of Upolu in Samoa. The house they had built at Velima, near the port of Apia, was a substantial 2-storey dwelling surrounded by 314 acres of land. It was an idyllic spot. And here's Robert Louis Stevenson on his veranda with the 1,549 foot, 472 metres, Mount Vea behind him. Here, gathered on the steps of his porch, are Stevenson and Fanny seated in the middle, with his stepson Lloyd and mother Margaret standing. She had moved into Vailima in May 1891, and Graham Balfour, his cousin, who had joined them with his son in August 1892. To the right is Stevenson standing with a Samoan chief. He would become increasingly interested in Samoan politics while living there. And this is the same veranda with his Samoan neighbours, for whom there was a mutual respect. They gave him the affectionate name of Tusitala, which means storyteller. And here on his 43rd birthday, on the 13th of November 1893, his neighbours again gathered to pay their respects to him. Appalled by the colonial exploitation of the Samoans by both the British and the Germans, he published a damning report, wrote letters to the Times, and backed the losing side in a week-long rebellion against the colonial-backed tribes. He fought for the release of the imprisoned, defeated Samoans, who in gratitude built a road through the jungle to link Vailima with the port of Apia, which they called the Road of the Loving Heart. He saw clear parallels between the clan conflicts that had bedeviled the history of his native land, and was moved to write Catriona and his final novel as a consequence. The final novel was called The Weir of Hermiston. It's set in Edinburgh and the borders at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and deals with the conflict between a sensitive son, Archie Weir, and his cruel hanging judge father. Like Stevenson at Edinburgh University, Archie is a free thinker and a prominent member of the Speculative Club, the university's most prominent debating society. He is banished to their moorland estate at Hermiston for disagreeing with the brutality of one of the hanging judge's sentences. Here he falls in love with Christina, his housekeeper's pretty young niece from a rough-hewn but well-to-do clan of reivers. Critics and Robert Louis Stevenson himself agreed that this was going to be his masterpiece, had he not died suddenly before its completion. Thus it was that on the evening of the 3rd of December 1894, whilst pulling a cork from a wine bottle, he suddenly collapsed and lost consciousness. He had just turned to Fanny and said, "What's that?" and "What a pain!" and put both hands to his head. "Do I look strange?" she asked, and then reeled and fell backwards. Stevenson had suffered a catastrophic stroke. He died a few hours later. He was 44 years old. The next day, more than 40 Samoans, including some chiefs, began the seemingly impossible task of clearing the jungle of the long, steep incline of Mount Vea. Here, Robert Louis Stevenson was buried with a thistle pin in his lapel on a plateau overlooking the sea, with the epitaph he had written for himself, which ends, "Home is the sailor, home from the sea, and the hunter, home from the hill." And in conclusion then, what, in the spirit of Monty Python, has Robert Louis Stevenson ever done for us? Well, over his 44 years, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote at least 11 novels, dozens of short stories, more than 100 essays, and several hundred poems. Today, he is one of the 30 most translated authors in the world. Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are iconic within their two distinct genres, and if he was to give us nothing else, his memory would be secured. But is he any more than a writer for children? I think he is. A good children's book should, I believe, have something to say to adults as well. As Leo Damrosch, his biographer, has said, Stevenson's extraordinary gift for making a young person's experience real, a boy in Treasure Island, a teenager in Kidnapped and Catriona, while embedding the story in a full context that only an adult could grasp. They are indeed books, like all of Stevenson's work, which are full of moral ambiguities. But there's more to Stevenson than a rollicking good yarn, and that's why he has his admirers in some exalted circles. Henry James, Conan Doyle, Hemingway, Kipling, and Bertolt Brecht were all fans, as was Georges Louis Borges, Marcel Proust, and J.K. Chesterton, who are quoted here. The Argentinian author and essayist George Louis Borges, who regarded reading as a form of happiness, was in particular a massive fan. And more recently, Hilary Mantel was also a great enthusiast. And there can be few authors who are celebrated in 3 continents. Here in Robert Louis Stevenson's museum in Samoa, in what was his former home at Vailima. Or in the state of California, which is a national park named after him. A quote from him about wine at the entrance of the Napa Valley. The wine is bottled poetry. And the waymarker on the Robert Louis Stevenson Trail in the form of a book. Or in Europe, both in France, this is Monastir-sur-Gazelle, where he and Modestine set out on their journey across the Cevennes. And in Edinburgh, where there's a young Louis playing with a dog outside his maternal grandfather's rectory, a memorial to Alan Breck Stewart and David Balfour at the point where they parted on the Coast-Defiant Hill, and a prominent section of the Edinburgh Writers' Museum where he shares pride of place with Robert Burns and Sir Walter Scott. But I'll leave the last word to Robert Louis Stevenson himself with a quotation from the poem that appears on a relief memorial by his friend, the American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, which can be found both at the St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh and the Hood Museum of Art in New Hampshire. Characteristically, it's a relief which shows from smoking. But these are the words. Bright is the ring of words when the right man rings them. Fair the fall of songs when the singer sings them. Still they are carolled and said, on wings they are carried after the singer is dead and the master is buried. Thank you for listening. And if you have any thoughts, questions, words or ideas, please feel free to share.
That was very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.